this is Dustin, and I am back with the second video in my three-part series of Introduction to Six Max No Limit Hold'em. This video is going to focus on flop play, and here's just a table of contents in case you want to use it for reference. It's just what we're going to go over. The bulk of the video is going to focus on continuation betting and facing continuation bets, and these first three things we're just going to go over pretty quickly to get down some definitions and kind of more general understanding that will help you when you're actually making decisions on the flop. And then after that, we'll just get into a little bit of theory in 3-bet pots. Alright, so a lot of people when they're just starting out with poker try to basically guess what hand their opponent has, if they even get that far. Like, some people just look at their own hand and don't even think about their opponent's hand. But kind of the next level is to start thinking about what your opponent has. But basically, instead of trying to guess what specific hand your opponents have, put them on a range of hands. And you should be narrowing down this range on each street. And going through this process is going to help you determine when to bet for value, when to bet as a bluff, and the best bet sizes in each situation. So for example, you open raise from the cutoff, it folds around to the big blind, a 22-18, and what this means when someone says a 22-18, it means their VPIP is 22 and their PFR is 18. And I talked about those stats in the last video, so if you don't remember what they are, just make sure you're familiar with it. Voluntarily put money in pot and how often someone raises preflop. So anyway, the 22-18 calls in the big blind. We can give this player a range of something like pocket fives through pocket jacks, ace-8 suited through ace-queen suited, king-jack, king-queen, ace-jack, ace-queen, and all suited broadways except for ace-king suited. And I put this player on this kind of range because we can assume that this player would probably 3-bet with queens, kings, aces, and ace-king, and then he would probably fold everything worse than these hands. So it's just kind of good to keep in mind that this is the range of hands that we'll give this player in this situation. And again, that'll help us know when to c-bet, when to check back, etc. Here's another pretty common example. You open under the gun, and a 24-20 3-bets from middle position. Now, without a specific read on what this player's 3-betting range is from middle position, we can usually assume it's something like queens, kings, aces, and ace-king. And that's a really strong range. And so this is a spot that you should fold ace-king and queen-queen. And so a lot of players, when they're just starting out, and even after they've been playing for a while, it can be pretty tempting to look at your hand and see ace-king or see queens and think, this is a really good hand, I should re-raise or I should call or something like that. But you have to be thinking about how your hand plays against your opponent's range. And so with a hand like ace-king, if you're facing a range of queens, kings, aces, and ace-king, you're really doing very, very badly. And so you should just fold your hand, even though technically it's better than the vast majority of hands pre-flop. So hopefully that makes sense. Alright. Another good thing to be thinking about is the strength of your hand. So after the flop comes down, it's really helpful to categorize your hand into one of three categories: strong, medium, or weak. And strong can usually be top pair, top kicker or better, often 2-pair or better. Medium is going to be usually like middle pairs and stronger draws. And then weak hands are going to be bottom pair, weak draws, like maybe a 6-high flush draw or something. And just total air, like ace-high or worse. And there are plenty of exceptions to these categories. For example, if you have pocket aces on 10, 9, 8, all hearts, and you don't have the ace of hearts, this hand could be considered medium or even weak, even though it's technically an overpair to the board. This is because there are many hands villains could have that are either ahead of your aces or have decent equity against your aces. So in this situation, you could easily be against a range of, sets, pocket tens, nines, eights, or any jack, any seven, any heart. Like, all those hands are either beating you or have pretty good equity against you. So your hand is pretty weak in that spot. So it's just good to be thinking about hand strengths in relative terms, and also how strong your hand is. And once you establish how strong your hand is, or what group your hand is in, that can kind of help you get an idea about what to do on the flop. So with your strong hands, you should usually be betting or raising. With your medium hands, usually check or call. And with weak hands, bet or raise or fold. And of course, these, like pretty much everything else in poker, are very general guidelines, but if you're unsure about what to do on the flop, kind of going through this process can usually give you a decent answer. Alright, now we're just going to talk about board texture, and this is kind of another definitions thing that you should be familiar with in order to learn and practice poker. So a dry flop is one with little, should be little, or no suitedness or connectedness. So for example, ace 7-2 rainbow, rainbow meaning all different suits, or king 8-4 rainbow. These flops, there's one high card and kind of two low cards, and the low cards are not close to each other, and none of the cards are suited. So these are very dry flops. And kind of what this means is it's not very likely for your opponent to connect with the flop because all the cards are spaced out in this way. And a wet flop, on the other hand, is one with a high degree of suitedness and or connectedness. So for example, Queen Jack 7 two-tone, I use TW to stand for two-tone, which just means two of the same suit. And so another example would be King 10-9 two-tone. These flops, as you can see, have a couple high cards and a bunch of connected cards close together, and there's two to a suit. So this means people are going to be, connecting with this board somewhat with any flush draw, any like pair plus gut shot, two pair, straight draws, etc. There's a lot of hands that people could have on these kind of flops that they're going to want to continue with. So we call those wet flops. And so just analyzing board texture has to do with determining how the flop connects with your opponent's range, and also being aware of how it connects with your range. Alright, now we're going to get into continuation betting. A continuation bet, or C-bet, is a bet made on the flop by the original pre-flop raiser. So here are just some examples of when you should generally be C-betting. When you can get called by worse hands, i.e. for value. When you can get better hands to fold, i.e. as a bluff. These two are pretty simple and straightforward. And then down here we get into a little bit more complicated situations. This one, you should C-bet when you can get hands with decent equity against you to fold, especially when your opponent is not likely to put more money in the pot unless he or she improves. So this is like if you have a hand like ace 10 and the flop comes 2-7-7 and you think your opponent has king queen, and you think they're going to fold to a bet, it's usually pretty good to bet there because yes, you're slightly ahead with ace high, but your opponent has 6 outs to improve. They can either make a king or a queen on the turn or river, and if they're not going to put any more money in anyway, unless they do, then it's better to just not give them free cards and just basically C-bet to collect the money in the pot and get your opponent to fold their equity. And then this last reason here, you should be more likely to C-bet out of position than in position, mostly because when you check out of position, it becomes easy for villain to bluff you. Basically, by checking out of position, you kind of reveal the strength of your hand a little bit more, because you're usually going to be betting with all your strong hands. So it's just going to put you in tougher decisions and make you make more mistakes, basically, when you check out of position. Whereas if the flop comes down and you're in position, you can pretty you can more frequently check it back and then see what your opponent is going to do on the turn, and thus putting you in more profitable situations. Alright, the next question is how big should you c-bet? Usually c-bets can be anywhere from half pot to full pot. Kind of a general guideline to go by is on drier boards, bet smaller, and on wetter boards, bet bigger. This is because on dry boards, like, ace 7-2, people are usually going to either call or fold, and you're going to be bluffing a lot, so it's good to just bet like close to half pot or something like that. And on wetter boards, there's going to be a lot more hands that people can continue with, so you want to either bet bigger to charge draws or just get value from worse hands on those wet boards, because there are going to be more hands that people are going to continue with, like I said. Alright, so kind of another way to think about this is when you're betting for value against plenty of worse hands, in other words, when there are a lot of worse hands in your opponent's range that they can call you with, then you can bet a lot bigger. You can bet close to pot, especially when these worse hands are like top pair or decent draws or better. So for example, if you have pocket threes on Jack 10-3 two-tone, you can bet pretty big. You can make about a pot-sized bet there, because you're probably going to get called by any jack, stuff like king queen, maybe queen 9 suited, king 10, queen 10 maybe, all flush draws, maybe like ace queen or ace king. There are a lot of hands that can call you here, and so basically you should try to get as much value as you can. And a lot of these hands are top pair, like ace jack, or decent draws like king queen or the nut flush draw, stuff like that. When you're betting for thinner value, on the other hand, such as when you have a hand like king jack on king 7-6 rainbow flop, then it's better to bet closer to half pot. There aren't that many better hands that you can get value from, there aren't that many worse hands that you can get value from in this situation. Depending on the situation, you could get value from worse kings, maybe pocket 8s, pocket 9s, pocket 10s, jacks and queens, stuff like that. And a lot of those hands aren't going to call a really big bet, but they'll definitely call a bet that's, half pot or slightly more than half pot. So in this kind of situation, it's good to bet maybe a little bit more than half pot, because on the other hand, some of the hands that are going to call you are actually better than yours, like better kings and sets and stuff like that. Okay, and the last point I have regarding sizing is that when you're bluffing on wet boards, it's sometimes best to bet less than half pot. Now, I should say first of all that when you move up in stakes, when you start playing maybe 1-2 and higher, it's going to be more important to balance your bet size and not give off too many bet sizing tells. But when you're playing micro stakes, when you're playing like 25 NL or 50 NL, it's totally fine in most situations to make pretty exploitable bet sizing, because really your goal should be exploiting your opponents and basically bluffing for as cheap as possible and getting as much value as possible. And players at these micro stakes usually aren't going to be good enough to pick up on this stuff. They're usually just going to be kind of playing their hand. So at these small stakes, and sometimes as you move up when you're playing against weaker players, it's good to bet less than half pot on really wet boards, because usually people are either going to connect with it in some way or totally miss it. And if they totally miss it, they're just going to fold no matter what, because the board is so wet. And if they connect with it in some way, they're also usually going to call no matter what, if they connect with it in a decent way. So, if the flop's like 8, 9, 10, all hearts, then that's not necessarily the best board to bluff on, but if you do choose to bluff it, you can maybe bet like a third of the pot or something like that, just because you're going to get all pocket pair. You're going to get like 2s through 6s to fold. You're going to get some ace highs without a flush draw to fold, stuff like that. So, just try try to think about what the best size is in each situation on your own. I've just kind of provided this slide to give you some general ideas. Oh, alright, we're going to get into some examples now. Alright, so these are going to be examples of opportunities to continuation bet. In this first one, we have ace-king from the cutoff. And obviously we choose to raise here. We can get called by plenty of worse hands, and I don't think we need to talk about that. We get called by the button, and the blinds fold. Now the flop is ace-10-5 with 2 spades. This is a very easy c-bet, and the reason we continuation bet here is for value. We can get called by plenty of worse hands. We can get called by weaker aces. We can get called by 10-9, Jack-10, King 10 suited, Queen 10 suited. Maybe even gut shots like King-Jack or King-Queen. We can get called by flush draws. And all these hands are in villain's range here for calling pre-flop. So for all those reasons, we can definitely continuation bet on this board, as we do. We bet 5 into 750, which I think is pretty good. Again, all flush draws and all weaker aces and stuff like that are going to call us here. So, there's the first one. Okay, here we have pocket sixes under the gun. We choose to raise, which is pretty standard, and we get called by the button again. This is a 50-cent dollar table, obviously, as you can see, and everyone else folds. Here, the flop is pretty similar. It's ace-10-5 with 2 hearts. And, we have sixes and we don't have a heart. Now, here the question is, do we c-bet or not? And I think the answer is no. Basically, we're not getting called by worse hands. Maybe we get called by flush draws, but even flush draws have pretty good equity against us, and we're out of position. So even getting called by flush draws is not great, but really most of what we get called by is like ace-x or 10x, stuff like that, maybe pocket jacks or something. So we can't get value. Then the question is, can we bluff? Well, we can probably get some better hands to fold, I guess, but pretty much just, pocket sevens and pocket eights. But there really aren't, and pocket nines, but there really aren't that many better hands that we can get to fold. So we can't bet for value, we can't bet as a bluff, and really we just don't have much equity in this hand. We only have 2 outs to improve, and additionally this board hits villain's range pretty hard. He's probably going to be calling on the button here with a fair amount of aces and a fair amount of suited cards and broadways. And so really this is just a spot to check fold. So we decide to not c-bet, and our opponent bets, and we fold. So hopefully that makes sense. Alright, here's the next hand. In this hand we have Jack-9 suited on the button. It folds around to us, and we choose to raise. We raise here because we can definitely steal the blinds, which is plus EV. And if we get called, we're going to be able to play in position with Jack-9 suited. And this is a hand that can flop pretty well. It can flop a lot of, flush draws and straight draws and okay pairs. And so we're just going to get called by a lot of hands that are probably just going to check fold a lot of flops, plus we can pick up equity. So very standard open here on the button with Jack-9 suited. And the small blind folds, and the big blind calls. So this is pretty much the definition of a dry board. And the big blind checks. Yes, the big blind could have some aces in his range, but he probably also has a lot of hands like king high, queen high, pocket sixes, fives, fours. There are a lot of hands we can get to fold by c-betting here. And so we choose to c-bet $3. We probably don't have to make it quite this big. We could probably make it $2.50. Just because it's such a dry board, it's not likely to hit our opponent, and we can win the pot right now. And we do have a backdoor flush draw, which is something. It's not much in this spot, but I would be c-betting here even without one, and our opponent folds. So this is just a pretty standard spot to c-bet bluff. And I think... Alright, yeah, this is our last example for c-betting. Here we pick up ace-7 suited on the button. Again, we raise here. We're probably raising with any ace on the button. And we get called by the big blind again. Now the flop is king, queen, 6. This is a little bit wetter of a flop than the previous example. There are two high cards on the right next to each other. It is a rainbow board though, but if you'll remember, when the big blind calls, or assuming this is kind of a standard regular player, not a huge fish or anything, we can give him a range of a lot of hands, a lot of Broadway hands, so like any two face cards, and then some pocket pairs. And so the question becomes, do we c-bet this board or not? And you might say, so our opponent checks, and we choose to check back. And so you might say, well, we could bet to get, pocket 5s to fold, so we could bluff against pocket 5s and pocket 4s, and maybe even 7s through 9s. And that's true, but our opponent also has a lot of Broadway hands, a lot of king X hands, queen X hands, hands like Jack 10 that they're just gonna call a raise with. And on the other hand, in addition to that, this player is probably just gonna check fold hands like pocket 4s on the turn. So we don't really gain anything by trying to bluff our opponent on this flop. We're just getting called by a bunch of better hands, and the other hands that we could get to fold are just going to fold later on in the hand anyway. So we choose to check back, like I said, and I know this is a flop-based video, but just to show you guys, the turn is a blank, 2 of diamonds. At this point, I expect our opponent to bet with a king and check without one, so he checks again, and now he can bet and get him to fold stuff like pocket 3s. So there we go. Alright. Now we're going to get into facing a continuation bet. Clearly we have 3 options. We can raise, call, or fold. And again, if you want to make things simple, just determine the strength of your hand. Remember, strong, medium, or weak, and act accordingly. But you should, again, those are examples, and it's important to really understand why you're taking each action in each situation, just so you understand important exceptions, and so you can really make the best decision in each unique situation. So you should be raising when there are plenty of worse hands in villain's range that he/she will call or re-raise with. So this is pretty straightforward. You should be raising when you can definitely get good value. Calling gets a little bit more complex. You should call when you are likely to have the best hand but are unlikely to get value by raising, or you are getting correct odds to make your draw. And playing draws is kind of beyond the scope of this video, but I'm sure there will be other videos about that. And the third reason is as a float. And floating is the act of calling a c-bet with a weak hand with the intention of winning the hand by bluffing on a later street. Here are some situations where you should float. Or kind of some guidelines that should be in place when you choose to float. You have some kind of equity, such as a gut shot or overcards. You are not likely to get credit for raising the flop, such as maybe on a really dry flop. If you raise, your opponent is going to think it looks bluffy, just because why would you raise on a dry flop? You would just probably be calling with, top pair, and maybe folding with other stuff. another thing is when villain has a high flop c-bet percentage, like around 70 or higher, and a low turn c-bet percentage, like around 35 or less, and also when villain folds a lot to turn bets. This is a really excellent spot to float because your opponent is going to be c-betting a lot without a strong hand, because no one makes good hands, 70% of the time or more, and then they're probably just going to be giving up on the turn. So all you have to do is call their flop bet, and then bet on the turn when they check to you, and you win the pot. And you should fold when you have little to very little equity in the pot, and you do not think you can effectively bluff. So now we're going to get into some specific examples of when you are facing a c-bet. Here's the first one. We have pocket twos on the button. Middle position raises, and we choose to call. Basically, we're just trying to flop a set and make money. And we do. Flop comes ace of hearts, queen of spades, two of spades. We have bottom set. The first thing to notice is that, I guess first of all, our hand is very strong. And secondly, the board is pretty wet. There's two high cards, an ace and a queen, and there's two suited cards, two spades. And so our opponent c-bets. So now we're faced with a decision. Obviously, we're not folding. Should we call or should we raise? This is a spot where generally you should be raising, because there are a ton of worse hands that our opponent can either call or raise with, and so we can get plenty of value by raising here. And it's important to kind of figure out what specific hands your opponent can have that are worse that will do those things with, just to be sure that raising is the right play. So your opponent can have hands like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, king queen that he might decide to call or re-raise with, plenty of flush draws. The fact that the ace of spades is not on the flop means that our opponent could have the ace of spades, and so re-raise with a flush draw, against which we have around 75% equity, which is pretty awesome. A ton of hands. Maybe he might even try to bluff raise us with like jack 10 of hearts or something like that. So clear spot to raise. Our opponent c-bets to 4, we raise to 16. Yep, nice hand. Here's the next example. We have ace 5 suited on the button. The cutoff opens. We can call here. The cutoff is going to have a wide opening range, and so we can flat with ace 5 suited and play in position. We should be able to play pretty well with this hand. And the blinds fold. The flop comes down. What's going on? Okay, 8 of hearts, 6 of clubs, 10 of clubs. Obviously, this is a pretty bad flop for our hand, and so our hand is probably in the weak category, but it is worth noting that it's like the top of, it's one of the strongest hands in the weak hand category that we could have. So our opponent c-bets. So what do? Well, our hand is not strong enough here to call. So we could fold. I don't think that would be terrible, but I think it's going to be a little bit better to raise. Because in this situation, our opponent is, again, probably has a fairly wide range from the cutoff. A lot of hands like, ace jack, ace queen, a lot of other Broadway hands, king high and queen highs, and then a bunch of pocket pairs too. Like he could easily have, 2s through 5s in this situation. And so all those hands are just going to fold when we raise. Additionally, we have some equity in the pot. We have a backdoor nut flush draw. We have an overcard, the ace. And if we do get called, we can continue aggression on some overcards and some hearts, and that's going to be an important consideration. So for all these reasons, I think we can raise here as a bluff, and this is going to be a good spot to raise when we're facing a c-bet. And our opponent folds. Alright. Here we have King Queen in the big blind. The button raises to $3 and the small blind folds. I think without really good reads, this is a pretty standard spot to just call. Our hand is too strong to fold against a button open, and it's not quite strong enough to 3-bet because we probably just get better hands to call and worse hands to fold. So choose to just call. And the flop is King 7-2, rainbow. Another pretty dry flop. So the general play here is going to be check to the pre-flop raiser, and then they choose to c-bet for $4 into $6.50. Now, here our hand, we have top pair, pretty good kicker. Obviously we're not folding, so then do we call the raise? Well, we can definitely call because, and should call, because we probably have the strongest hand, but we probably cannot get a ton of value by raising. So it just becomes a standard spot to call. Like if we raise, we just get a bunch of worse hands to fold and some better hands to call, like ace king and sets. But by just calling, we, get value in this bet, and then we can potentially also make some more money later in the hand. So we choose to call. Yep. Alright, in this example, we have Jack 10 suited on the button. The cutoff opens, and we call on the button with Jack 10 suited. This is pretty standard. Similar reasons to why we called with Ace 5 suited. Our hand is going to play pretty well post-flop in position against a wide range. We're going to be able to bluff and semi-bluff pretty effectively, and it can also, make good hands. Flop here is Ace 8-3, and our opponent c-bets. Okay. Here, we definitely have a weak hand, but I still think calling here is going to be the best option. And this is an example, this is a perfect example of a float. For the record, I don't think folding here is going to be terrible. And if you don't feel totally comfortable, and if you don't have good reads, then maybe folding here is just going to be the best play. But this is a very dry flop again, and so we can expect our opponent to be continuation betting with close to 100% of their range. And since it's a dry flop, almost by definition, they're not going to hit it very hard. They're going to have a lot of random pocket pairs and probably suited connectors for opening from the cutoff, and broadways, king queen, queen jack, stuff like that. And so we could raise, and I actually don't think raising would be terrible, but for one thing, I definitely don't think it's the best play, and I definitely don't think it's very good, because we definitely only get better hands to call, and we do get some better hands to fold, but again, those hands are probably just going to check fold the turn. And additionally, it looks kind of bluffy when we raise this dry of a flop, like I said before, so there's not really any reason to do that. In addition to all that, we do have some backdoor equity. We have a backdoor flush draw and backdoor straight draw. So all that stuff helps when we're floating, like I said before. So we decide to call as a float, and the turns are relative blank. It gives us a flush, or it gives us a gut shot straight draw, and our opponent check folds the turn as planned. Okay, a couple more examples of facing c-bets. Here we have Ace 4 suited on the button. A fish calls from middle position, and we can definitely call in position against a fish. You'll notice we have a little bit deeper stacks actually in this example. So we choose to call on the button, and the blinds fold. feel like I'm talking really fast. Okay, the flop is Queen of Hearts, Jack of Hearts, 7 of Clubs. And the fish c-bets. What do we do? And it might be helpful, since we've gotten this far in the video, for you to kind of guess what we should do before I tell you the answer. So the answer is fold. In this situation, our hand is definitely in the weak category, and we don't really have any backdoor equity, and this is a pretty wet board, so it's pretty likely to connect with our opponent. Our opponent could have, a lot of Queen X, Jack X, straight draws, flush draws. And so we really can't float effectively, we really can't bluff raise effectively, so this is really just going to be a spot to give up and fold the flop. And there's no shame in folding on the flop in the right situations. It's, a very important play to be able to do. So the fish bets and we fold. Alright. Here we have pocket sevens in the big blind. The cutoff raises and we call. 3-betting in this situation is going to be okay sometimes, but calling is definitely the standard play. Whoa, flop is Queen of Diamonds, Jack of Diamonds, King of Diamonds. This is pretty much the definition of a wet flop. All high cards right next to each other, monotone, all diamonds. And so basically here's another spot where we check to the preflop raiser, pretty standard, and the preflop raiser bets. What do? Well, this is a very easy fold. We have no equity. This board could hit this player pretty hard. Not everyone c-bet bluffs in this kind of board, so we can be somewhat confident that it hit our opponent in some way. So we just decide to fold, and this is a very standard hand. Another option against some players would just be to bet to donk bet $2 into this pot. And again, I think donk betting is kind of beyond the scope of this video. Maybe I'll do a different video about that, but it's just good to be thinking about all possible options in each situation and come to the best decision. But definitely the standard play here is to check fold. So there we have it with our with our examples in terms of facing c-bets. Here we go. Now, kind of to wrap up this video, I'm just going to briefly go over how you should be c-betting in 3-bet pots. Generally, how this is going to work is, well, I guess you could be in position or out of position, but usually, the button will open to 3 big blinds, and you'll 3-bet from the big blind with 10 to 10 big blinds, and the button will call. And so then you're put into this situation. Assuming 100 big blind stacks, this is very important, c-bets in 3-bet pots should usually either be a half pot or full pot, and not anything in between. What happens in this situation when you bet like 3/4 pot, which is kind of a standard, standard c-bet size in a single raise pot, is that, to put it bluntly, I guess, stacks just get messed up. Stack sizes get messed up on the turn. You end up with like 1.5 times the pot or so in your stack, and it makes your turn decisions and river decisions really uncomfortable and awkward, and it's going to basically make you make mistakes, and yeah. Alright, so c-betting half pot gives you the option to bet half pot again on the turn and then shove the river. You should be doing this on drier flops and or when you want your opponent to call you with a wide range of hands. So just for example, off the top of my head, if you have ace king and the flop is ace 8 4, you should usually be c-betting half pot, because you can get called by worse aces, maybe you'll even get floated, and your hand is not that vulnerable, so you can usually bet 3 streets for value. On the other hand, c-betting full pot allows you to shove the turn. And this should be done with semi-bluffs or with value hands on wetter boards. So maybe an example of this is you have the nut flush draw on kind of a wet board, and so you could c-bet full pot because you get your opponent to fold out, weak pairs and stuff like that, and then you also have the possibility of shoving the turn if you think your opponent is likely to fold there. And I don't think we have much more time in this video, so I'm going to get into some specific 3-bet pot examples in the final video. So, stick around for that. And this has been the end of my video on flop play. I hope it's been helpful. Please feel free to get in touch with any comments or questions or feedback. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. The next video is going to focus on the turn and river, tilt control, and putting it all together. And iPokerVIP hooked me up with a new email address. You can get in touch with me at dustin@ipokervip.net. And that's it. Take it easy.